Hello. So this is going to be a little bit different than what I usually post on the channel. This is going to be not a podcast episode to say, but more of just a fun little video going over the First European War and how Russia has the potential and ends up winning in the Lore of the Fire Rises if the player wins the war. So I'm going to talk about the lore behind that and the different battles that occur and actions that are taken by governments in able to get power. So without further ado, let's get into the background. The world that we enter in the Fire Rises is not the same as the one that we currently live in. As a result of the 2020 election and different geopolitical events that are going on around the world, the United States falls into a second civil war that cripples its ability to work to defend Europe from outside factors. As this occurs, Russia takes advantage of this opportunity and annexes territories in Georgia and in Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't mean it doesn't really matter. And starting in early 2022, Putin gets diagnosed and dies of COVID 19. This death leads to a power struggle between three major factions in the country. The first faction is the party that has been loyal to Putin for his entire reign, which is United Russia, which is led by Dmitry Medvedev. The second faction are the communists, led by Gennady Zarovov. And the third faction are the ultranationalists, led by Vladimir Zhirinovsky. And the player can choose who wins the election, but going down the path of Medvedev, he, of course, wins the election. Medvedev works to fix corruption that's plaguing the country or pay off the corruption, so it's not really like a big issue. And he works to gain Russian superiority and control over the Caucasus and Central Asia, all of which he's able to successfully achieve. Russia annexes Belarus before all the resources are turned to Ukraine. Now, the Russian military in this time is better than what we have today, partly due to Russia's economy booming after the US collapse in the oil crisis and economic crises that hit the EU during this time period. Russia also rolls back a lot of its reforms from 2008, which allows its military to be more stronger, top-down leadership rolled in force. So, getting to the actual beginning or the first phase of the war starts when the player chooses, which is usually recommended to be sometime around 2026, 2027. On paper, Russia has around 748,000 troops prepared for the invasion of Ukraine, along with another 120,000 militia or loyal troops from Transnistria and Donetsk and Luhansk. Ukraine, on the other hand, depending on however many troops do they have at their disposal, is usually around 467,000, somewhere around that range, with a sizable amount of militia that joins in the fight as the war begins. So as the war begins and Russian troops cross into the country, they encounter very strong resistance from Ukrainians who rally to fight against the invasion. There is mass recruitment and large amounts of troops are engaged in heavy combat. NATO does send military aid, but there's no immediate response aside from more sanctions and just sending aid to Ukraine, as NATO hasn't gotten its full military capacity prepared and isn't looking to escalate the conflict. The advance that Russia has towards Kiev and the rest of the country does stall, and despite this stalling, just the sheer mass of troops Russia has in comparison to Ukraine's military causes Ukraine to have to retreat from a lot of border territory and struggle against the much more prepared and modernized Russian military. So, as the special military operation enters week 3 of its commitment, Russian forces begin to launch assaults on Ukraine's capital, Kiev. While many of the Ukrainian defenders do fight resiliently, it's ultimately a major struggle against a much more prepared and armed Russian military. The Russian airborne VDV is dropped into Hostomel Airport just north of Kiev in order to create a aerial bridgehead to lower supplies and troops in for the final assault on Kiev. The city does switch hands multiple times in the fighting that quickly ensues around the area. However, it's eventually seen that Russian forces are able to successfully capture the city after a couple of weeks. The humanitarian costs that are involved in this are extreme, with entire cities being blown to rubble and many different civilians being stuck in the middle of this heavy combat. The UN demands a ceasefire from both sides, but there is no result at all, and Europe continues to send more aid to fight against the invasion. With the air bridge established and Kiev in the Russian hands, Russian troops in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and northern in Kiev launched an all-out assault on the western half of Ukraine. Ukrainian resistance begins to struggle as Russian forces are able to be properly supplied and advance more towards the major cities of Lviv towards NATO. However, a lucky event happens that causes Ukraine to not yet be lost. So further north, around Grodno in Belarus, a major event happens that leads to Europe finally putting their foot down with the Russian invasion. At the Babuinsky Brestovista border crossing, there are gunfire that is exchanged between Russian slash Belarusian troops and Polish troops. Polish soldiers respond to this incursion by crossing back into Belarus in a very unorganized counterattack. Whilst there are both sides investigating and both sides are trying to de escalate the conflict, it seems that no results has come from that. Poland and other representatives quickly go to NATO's headquarters and decide to meet and invoke Article 5. And with that, this is the beginning of the First European War. As the war began to ramp up and NATO troops began to flood into Belarus and the Baltics in that region, a lot of the naval infantry and VDV that were stationed in Kaliningrad prior to the conflict starting are encircled. While these forces are holding out, the Poles and Germans launch multiple assaults in order to take the city. Despite these attacks and the ferocity of NATO air supremacy so far in the conflict, the combined NATO forces are unable to actually seize the city of Kaliningrad. Heavy urban fighting then begins as VDV and naval infantry have fortified themselves in the city, and NATO is forced to obliterate the city in order to even have a chance at taking it. This doesn't really do much, but a lot of the more suburban slash farmland regions of the enclave are actually taken. Despite this, the Baltic Fleet has been mobilized by the Russian government, and troops and supplies are being sent in while civilians are being evacuated. Meanwhile, Russian troops stationed in Kaliningrad have attempted to launch multiple assaults into the Suwalki Gap in order to cut off the Baltics and be able to get a land bridge slash resupply to Kaliningrad itself. Whilst this assault was not yet successful, it did dent NATO lines, which caused panic within the high command. Meanwhile, down south in Ukraine, Russian troops continue to advance and force NATO and the Ukrainians out of the country. At this point of the war, Ukraine's military, being so depleted from the initial fighting to hold off the Russians, have begun to crumble due to a lack of supplies and lack of support. At the same time, NATO is not really able to help due to crippling weapon and manpower shortages that do not allow them to aid their Ukrainian allies as much anymore. With that, Ukraine essentially capitulates to the Russian military, and Russia begins to launch codenamed Operation Brusilov in order to smash through weakened NATO lines and take Bucharest and Bulgaria, separating the major southern NATO allies like Greece and Turkey from the rest of NATO further north. This will also be a distraction to take NATO troops away from the Suwalki Gap in Poland and force them to move them down south. So with the beginning of Operation Brusilov, NATO forces are forced into a disastrous retreat that sees Bucharest and a majority of Romania fall. Russian troops then begin to enter Dobruja within northern Bulgaria and seize many major logistical hubs. NATO has an emergency meeting whilst this is going on, and due to the divisions within the different militaries, it's decided one NATO army under one NATO command would be created. This would eliminate the early divisions that NATO had in vain hopes that this would help strengthen the defense against the Russians and allow them to launch further offensives. However, despite this, Russian offensive operations continue and Russian troops are able to advance at a rate that NATO is unable to reply to. Manpower and weapon shortages within NATO continue to get increasingly worse as Russian forces take logistic hub after logistic hub, and NATO was cut off from funding it once got from the United States and Western allies in the region. With a Russian victory in the south and NATO forces being forcefully moved from other fronts to reinforce against Operation Brusilov, Russian forces begin a major assault into the Baltics, codenamed Operation Surovov. With the completion of the Ukrainian special military operation, Russian forces are taken from that region and moved north to the Baltics. NATO troops hold on to every inch of territory they possibly can, but Russian troops are able to overwhelm them. Russian troops successfully seize Tallinn in Estonia and capture a majority of the country along with Latvia. However, NATO begins an assault along Vilnius in Lithuania in order to break through into Belarus and block the Russian assault. This fails as Belarus was heavily fortified, and a counterattack that occurs by Russia back into Lithuania also fails. However, Kaliningrad does hold on, and NATO forces begin to crumble in the face of the Russian assault. So Operation Surovov's success leads to the Baltics crumbling as Russian forces continue their assault. NATO is forced to evacuate the Baltics as High Command mandates them, and it seemed that it was only likely a matter of time before Russia would successfully seize all three of the Baltic states. Russian forces reached the Baltic Sea at Riga and split the forces still stuck in Estonia from the forces that were stuck further south. Russian forces began to push south and took Vilnius and all of Lithuania, and were able to properly be able to reconnect with Kaliningrad, which the siege had been broken by this point. Russian forces then began to push from Kaliningrad into northern Poland against crumbling NATO resistance. Despite some holdout NATO troops in Riga and the Estonian islands, the Baltics seemed firmly under Russian control by this point. Meanwhile, Russian forces that were stationed in Belarus and northern to middle Ukraine, like western Ukraine, began to launch a major offensive, Operation Zhukov, in order to knock Poland out of the war and force NATO troops to withdraw behind the Oder River in Germany. The offensive did have a slow start, but eventually things got underway and NATO forces began to crumble with the increased Russian support in the region. Russian forces eventually reached the city of Warsaw in Poland, and heavy fighting began between NATO forces and the Russian army. Despite heavy fighting and fortifications had been built around the city, Russian troops and NATO troops were unable to fully defend/capture the city, and Russian troops decided to withdraw. When Russian troops returned 2 days later, the city had been 90% destroyed, and a majority of NATO forces had withdrawn, except for some rearguard action to slow the Russian advance. While Russia did capture Warsaw, it came at heavy costs, with many troops dying in the process, and NATO forces being forced to withdraw deeper into Poland. Meanwhile, on the southern front, Romania was fully seized by the Russian military, and advances began into Slovakia and Hungary. The capture of Bucharest caused the collapse of morale in the south, which led to Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey signing secret treaties with Russia that saw them exit the war. Russian forces then began an assault called Operation Rokossovsky to take Budapest in Hungary and Bratislava in Slovakia. Despite things starting off relatively slow, Russian forces were able to advance on both cities. Most of the NATO forces in the south were made up of French and Czech troops, which were undersupplied and ignored for reinforcements, as the main fronts in Poland and the Baltics had sucked up a majority of NATO's resources. Russian troops were able to reach Budapest and capture the city with minimal resistance, whilst the main defense at Bratislava proved to be a major challenge for the Russian military. With the fall of Warsaw to Russian forces and the continued success of Operation Zhukov, the majority of NATO forces withdrew across the Oder River, with just some Polish divisions remaining to hold the line against the Russian assault. Politicians in Germany decided that it would not be worth continuing the war for there to be a potential assault on Germany itself, and therefore signed a secret agreement with Russia that stated that Polish forces would be formed into a demilitarized zone between Germany and Russian-controlled Poland, and that there would be a cease of hostilities in that region. Despite this, fighting still continued in the Czech Republic, but at this point, NATO essentially gave up on the war. This led to peace negotiations beginning between both sides. With the peace negotiations finally reaching their end, Russia declared victory in the First European War. The war saw a Russian victory in Eastern Europe and the occupation of Ukraine, Transnistria, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, the Baltics, and most of Poland. Czechoslovakia was formed into a neutral buffer state where the Czechs and Slovaks were once again reunited into one country. Pro-Russian governments were also established in Serbia and Croatia as well. The war saw mass casualties and mass destruction and would lead to the collapse of democracy in Western Europe. France would experience a heavy revolution which would overthrow the government and lead to instability. Meanwhile, Germany would form a new European Union which would unite with the Benelux and would begin a major arms buildup in case of a future conflict with Russia. Meanwhile, Russians celebrated their victory in the First European War, and many of their military would quickly be demobilized. It was a major milestone in the history of Europe, and Russia would then be the dominant power of Europe for now.